Today's guest is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a distinguished military strategist, decorated combat veteran, and seasoned commentator. With a wealth of experience in the U.S. Army, Colonel Macgregor has served our nation with distinction, earning numerous awards for his leadership and bravery. He's one of the most sought-after military minds for discussing the Russia-Ukraine war and other U.S. military interactions. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure, happy to be with you, Steve.
So right out of the gates, I want to get something that has me confused because this is a gentleman that seems like he should have more commentary in alignment with your thinking, but he seems to fall in line with the CNN generals. But this is General Ben Hodge says if
Hodges.
NATO
His name is
Hodges
Hodges, yeah.
Hodges if NATO doesn't ramp up production and military bodies, Vladimir Putin will attack, not because he is provoked by NATO, but because he sees NATO as unprepared. Is there any truth to what he's saying, or is this just fear-mongering?
I think we can say with total certainty that nothing that comes out of General Hodges' mouth is informed or truthful. He was the former commander as a three-star of the small force still left in Germany at the end of the Cold War. And he saddled up with people that are paying him handsomely for plugging the war with Russia, the proxy war. And he's, as a result, incurably anti-Russian. And he's also ridiculously optimistic. And he's been talking about with a few more missiles and a few more tanks, the Ukrainians are going to retake Crimea and roll forward into Russia. This has been going on for months and months and months. He's never come to terms with reality. And of course, he has no interest in doing so. It's not going to pay him any money.
Yeah. Well, based on who was having him on his show, I figured he was probably being paid $5,000 to $10,000 a month to say Ukraine is going to win, U.S. taxpayer money is justified, Putin is weaker than we think, and they will take back territory. I understand where he's coming from, where, you know, if the U.S. military or another country doesn't look prepared and an enemy wanted to attack, they would have justification. But this idea that Vladimir Putin wants to roll in and take over Berlin and Paris and other areas of Europe seems ridiculous to me. What are your
Well,
thoughts?
a couple of years ago, every time someone talked about the fighting in Ukraine, the same cast of characters, retired generals, both UK and US, as well as the sort of status quo swamp creatures in Washington, kept telling the American people, oh, the Russians are incompetent. They can't get anything right. The Russians are losing. And I don't know how many senior political figures that spoke to me within a month or 6 weeks of the war's beginning and said, well, what do you think? I said, well, this is a catastrophe. We need to stop this war immediately. And they said, really? I said, absolutely. They said, well, the Ukrainians are winning. I said, no, they're not. This it hasn't really even gotten off the ground yet. I said, you know, if we don't stop this, they'll be destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians will die for nothing. People were absolutely stunned because the Western media was all preaching the same line of nonsense. So that's never really changed. And even now, after we had the prosecutor general of Ukraine, who went on Ukrainian television on the 7th of January and told the population, we've lost 500,000 dead soldiers, Ukrainians. Well, I've been saying that for some time, and everybody's, oh, that's impossible. Oh, no, that's the Russians. No, the Russians have lost far, far fewer. I would say the exchange ratio is probably about 1 to 7 and going up. And we have given the Ukrainians terrible advice, and we flooded them with a lot of equipment that they couldn't possibly employ effectively without years of experience. We tried to build an army on the fly. So today, Ukraine is in ruins. The graveyards are full, and they continue to fill up. Now the Russians are capturing men in their 70s and boys 14 and 15 in uniform. You know, they have to send out press gangs to force people into the Ukrainian military. People in Western Ukraine are horrified now. They don't want to be dragged into this, even though they all universally detest Russians, but they don't want to fight in this war. If the truth were printed or stated publicly, we'd have a much clearer picture of Zelensky as a complete and utter fraud. someone who doesn't represent the interests of Ukraine at all. And he's busy running around trying to sell out his country to BlackRock and its subsidiaries, Monsanto and others, with this rich farmland, and looking forward, I guess, to a comfortable retirement in one of his villas in Italy or Cyprus or somewhere else, or probably in Florida at some point. This whole thing is a scam, and the Ukrainians have been exploited mercilessly by us. And then you hear people say, like our friend Senator Lindsey Graham, oh, we should be so grateful. No Americans have really died. Well, we know somewhere between 450 and 500 Americans, whether they were in uniform or not, or contractors, they've died in Ukraine. But again, the administration isn't going to let anybody know that. It's not going to be published, but it's true. I don't know the exact figure, but that's roughly accurate based on my sources in Eastern Europe. And he's saying, well, the Russians are being harmed, and we're doing this at bargain basement prices. I mean, just imagine that. We've exploited these people to do something we think benefits us. It doesn't. And the truth is that Russia economically is stronger and healthier now than it was 2 years ago, infinitely more. And Russia is now leading a substantial portion of the world in the direction of the gold standard, which would put an end to us, frankly, because we're the money printing center of the world. And once you go to a gold standard, that falls apart. And at the same time, the Russians have built a magnificent army and a much improved air force, and their submarine fleet is in excellent shape. Their surface fleet's not so much, but frankly, Russia doesn't need much of a surface fleet, to be blunt. So at the end of the day, we look ridiculous. Our armed forces are in terrible shape. And a lot of the equipment that went over there wasn't used properly. And so most people have concluded that our equipment and technology is third rate. So if anything, what we've done is present a picture to the whole world of extreme weakness, as well as ruthless selfishness, deceit, and greed, because we've made lots of money from the war. When I say we, I'm talking about the famous military-industrial congressional complex, which is why they still want to send money there, because they know the money isn't going to do much for Ukraine or the equipment, but the profits will all go into people's pockets here. So it's all the way around a terrible, disgraceful fraud, and I'm sure it's one of these things that you'll turn on PBS and there'll be a frontline documentary in 5 or 6 years and tell us all about the tragedy. But in the meantime, all the people that are even making that sort of thing are all signed on for this tragic war, and people are still dying. And there's nobody left in Ukraine. I should say nobody, but millions have left that country, and they will never go back.
Yeah.
So the country itself is in serious trouble.
Yeah. I like how Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said to the American people, specifically Republicans, that he can't keep on board. Don't worry, we're not sending your money to Ukraine. We're sending it to American contractor companies. Like you just told us how this is a giant money laundering scheme back to your donors.
Exactly. But, he's part of the proverbial swamp, and that's why most of us have figured out, and the organization that I'm now the CEO for, Our Country, Our Choice, most of our members have figured out that there's not much difference between the Republicans or Democrats in Washington. No matter who you vote for, you get the same policy outcome. So you've got a bipartisan uniparty that is doing exactly what you described, Stephen. Absolutely. I hope every American understands this. I don't think they do, but I wish they would.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Okay. Volodymyr Zelensky has asked the country of Switzerland to host peace talks for Ukraine. However, they've specifically said no one from Russia is allowed to attend these peace talks. So why pick Switzerland, and why not invite an envoy or a diplomat from Russia if you really want this thing to end?
Well, initially, I was delighted when that report came through because I thought thank God, this is going to end. And I was surprised, and justifiably so, that Zelensky, who is probably one of the most criminal characters that's ever risen to power in Europe, perhaps the most criminal in many respects and corrupt, Stalin. But, having said that, it didn't turn out to be the case, as you point out. And it simply is turning into another pass the hat around and throw money in it for what he calls reparations. reparations being, oh, we're going to rebuild Ukraine. It's back to the same scam I was describing earlier that involves BlackRock and Larry Fink and the rest of these characters. That's very tragic, but I'm sure the Senate is delighted, and I know Mitch McConnell is because he's got his hands in all of that, and he's undoubtedly going to profit as well as most of his colleagues. So I guess the whole thing is a scam. Now, Switzerland's in trouble, Stephen, and Americans are not aware of this because the Swiss decided to cast their lot for the first time in centuries with a crazy EU and with NATO, effectively, because what they've said is, oh, Russians are evil, Russians are bad, let's all support Zelensky. So Switzerland is no longer taken seriously as a neutral state, which is a terrible, terrible loss to the world because Switzerland is a place where everyone who hated each other could come and sort out differences because Switzerland was genuinely neutral. It is not anymore. So even if they invited the Russians at this point, I don't think the Russians would show up. Same tragedy of losing Finland as a neutral state and Sweden. Those were places where warring parties could meet and sort things out. They are no longer. So I think the Russians would probably balk at that notion anyway. And frankly, why should they bother paying any attention to Zelensky or us? They've won the war. Everybody's like, well, they're still fighting. Well, if you're sending 70-year-olds and 15-year-olds into action, pregnant women, I'm told, have even shown up out there. Are you winning? I don't think so. And the Russians are gradually advancing all across the front. I think they're going to continue to advance. And then at some point, when they decide to do so, they will go right to the Dnieper River. Then the question they've got to ask is how much further do we go? And they don't want to go much further, to be frank, because the last thing that the people in Moscow want to do is rule Ukrainians. Why would they want to do that? They don't want to rule anybody who's not a Russian. That's a lot of trouble. They went through that after the Second World War. The Warsaw Pact was not some sort of great boon for the Soviets. It became one shortly after the war while they could exploit it and strip it of resources and technology, particularly the eastern parts of Germany that now reside in Poland and what was formerly East Germany. But they couldn't do it very long. And eventually it became a burden. Cuba is another example. Cuba was a huge money pit, just a drain on the Soviet economy, as frankly, so is Puerto Rico to us. I don't know why anybody opposes independence for Puerto Rico. I think they should have it and go away. But, we're stupid and we continue to hold on to these places. And the Russians finally figured out this is a waste and got out. And that was the right thing to do. They're not going to go back and repeat that. They really want to do business with the West. And they're nicely positioned to do business because they're going to be the sort of middleman or one of the key middlemen in Central Asia between China and the West. So why would they want a war? The Chinese don't want a war because war is bad for business. I know everybody finds that hard to believe in America, but truthfully, war is not good for business. It destroys your standard of living. It destroys your currency. We can go on and on and on. So I hope that at some point people will figure out that what Zelensky's all about, and then we can put this to bed. But it's not going to happen quickly.
Yeah, this thing in Switzerland kind of reminds me of like these MLM pyramid scheme companies where it's like a friend invites you over to show something that could be life-changing, and then next thing they're trying to get money out of you, right? Like, so at first I was like, why wouldn't he want somebody from Russia, a diplomat or Lavrov or somebody to come? But like you say, it's just to get people focus back on Ukraine, raise more money, get things going for BlackRock. Man, what a shame. I wanted to, I don't know, I'm sure you saw this, but the German Ministry of Defense has leaked a document showing an 18-month timeline, a predicted chronological timeline of how Vladimir Putin is going to take over Europe, where he's going to start different battles. Is this just a complete hypothetical that they're now using to scare Europeans and keep milking money out of them? Or is there any truth to this 18-month timeline?
Well, first of all, there's nothing hypothetical about it. It's a sham. It's an attempt to try and justify what's been going on in Ukraine and keep it going. on the assumption that people will look at this map, which is absurd, and begin to fear, the imminent arrival of the Russians, which is, they're not coming. And somehow or another, this will keep people like Scholz and Macron and others, globalists, in power. I mean, when you have nothing left, what do you do? Because right now, Scholz is about as popular as the plague in Germany. And the problem is that the Germans haven't been able to figure out who they're going to put in there to replace him. There are no, well, there may be in the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, there may be some stars in that group. You have the old communist Wagenknecht. She's a very, very intelligent and persuasive woman. But, there's nobody there that you can point to the way you could have said 30 or 40 years ago, well, there's Helmut Schmidt, he's a future chancellor. Or Helmut Kohl, he's a future chancellor. There's nobody that you can point to right now with certainty. So the Germans are sort of like a beached whale that is slowly dying. It's gotten into shallow water. It's deindustrialized itself. It's basically destroying itself. And it's infested with foreigners that have come into the country that the Germans don't want any more than the Scandinavians do. So the globalists have successfully destroyed Europe. Some people think it's dead forever. I don't agree with that, but it's going to be tough to cure it. But that's the problem. So you haul out these ridiculous things and say, oh, the Russians are coming. So see, you don't have any choice. You have to do what we say. If you look at that map, and I have, you could dust off the old Cold War discussions and plans and come up with something similar back in the 1970s or 80s. But in that period, it was real. There were real potentials for that sort of thing. This, absolutely not. This is just nonsense. And hopefully the Germans will treat it with the complete contempt that it deserves. But who knows? Too many people in our country, too many people in Western Europe and Poland and places like that continue to impute some degree of legitimacy and I would say honesty to their media. They should not. They just shouldn't. We're not hearing the truth through the regular media. I don't know what your listeners think, but if I really want to know something about anything in the world, I get on the internet and I start digging and going through and looking for alternative views and sources, many of which are very, very good, but will never find their way into the mainstream for the reasons that we're discussing. The mainstream media, like the financial sector, as well as our government, all in the hands of the same people who are trying to keep all of these things going and maintain a facade that somehow or another this is good for us. We all know it's not, but there's still too many people that want to believe. That comment that you used to hear on the X-Files, I want to believe, in UFOs or something. Well, that's the problem. We got to stop it. It's not true.
Yeah. Okay. You've mentioned BlackRock a couple of times. Presidential candidate RFK Jr. said in a speech, BlackRock and others already own Ukraine. It's been decided the real money will be made on this war when they rebuild Ukraine. So are these companies going to get to profit billions or possibly trillions of dollars off of American taxpayer money?
Well, I think that's the plan. And I think that Tony Blinken and his colleagues, as well as Larry Fink and, Zelensky, all of them are in bed together. They're all members of the same, class of people, and they all want to stuff their pockets full of cash. So unless somebody intervenes and stops it, I would say yes. And I feel terrible for the Ukrainians. I grew up with them. And they've been lied to from day one by this government, and they exploited Ukrainian nationalism, courage, and valor to destroy the country. So no, I'm afraid RFK Jr. is right, and he's probably the only one who has both identified who these criminals are that are going to destroy what remains of Ukraine, but also has told the truth about all of it. And I'm very grateful for it. I wish I would hear that from more candidates, but we're not hearing it.
Yeah. Okay. Give my audience a summary of what's going on near the Red Sea with the Houthis. All of a sudden, I'm hearing a lot about Iran, but then Yemen and the Houthis, and they're attacking, and the U.S. military is counterattacking. Give us just a rundown of this. What's going on in this situation?
Well, first, all of your viewers should stop for a second, pause, and remember that certainly over the last 30 years, lots of people have been talking about bombing Iran. And I remember when I was on active duty listening to John McCain sort of repeat this old song about Barbaran, and then he would say bomb, 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 bomb Iran. This has been going on forever. And the neocon globalist cabal has been trying desperately to bring a war on with Iran. Now, remember that what stood between war with Iran and reason, rationality, and peace the last time around in 2019 was Donald Trump. He said no. And what had happened was a global hawk had flown right along the edge of what we call the Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. And that was deliberate by the CENTCOM commander, then General McKenzie, and he was working with John Bolton and Secretary of State Pompeo, and they all thought this was brilliant because they knew there was better than a 50% chance that the Iranians would shoot down this global hawk, which, by the way, under international law, if you fly into the or on the edge of the air defense identification zone of any country and you don't alert that country that you're doing so with a military aircraft, then they have the right to shoot it down. And it specifically talks about in law, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, which is exactly what the global hawk is about. So the Iranians watched and watched and watched, and finally they said, well, I guess we shoot it down, and they did. Well, this was greeted with tremendous joy inside the Beltway, especially by the usual suspects. Oh, this is great. Now we have what we need. We can attack Iran. I mean, you've listened to General Keane on television. He's another one. All of these people are profiting from this. In other words, they're part of a cabal that rewards its supporters handsomely financially. And what they all said was, now we have what we need and let's go to war. And they brought the vans with all sorts of expensive technology over to the White House so that you could turn the White House into an immediate sort of war headquarters. They all descended upon President Trump in the Oval Office, and he asked a couple of important questions. One of the questions was, how many people are we going to kill if we do what you want? Because they already had the strike package with aircraft and missiles ready to go. And the answer was, well, perhaps 300, maybe 500. And he said, how many people did we lose as a result of Global Hawk? I said, well, it's unmanned, nobody. Then he said, well, after the strikes go in, then what? Well, the answer is, well, we have a war. And why? What's the point? What do we gain from this? And he said, no, thanks very much for all the information, appreciate it, but no, we are not going to respond to this with a massive strike package. So suddenly all the big donors like Adelson and the others who have been pressing hard, we must have a war. This is good for the United States. This is good for Israel. Iran has to be destroyed. Everybody was sad-faced, unhappy face. And everybody sort of, oh, this is terrible, and walked away from the White House. Donald Trump saved us from a calamity. Well, we're back in the same position again. This time, the Houthis. Who are the Houthis? The Houthis are Shiite Arab tribesmen that have finally become the major force in this place called Yemen, down at the bottom of the Saudi peninsula, the Arab peninsula. But they've been fighting for many years, at least up until 2016, for their lives and their survival against the Saudis and, guess what? Al-Qaeda, because Saudi Arabia enlisted Al-Qaeda fighters to fight on the ground for them, while the Saudis and we bombed the Houthis. Why? Well, they're Shiites. And the Shiites didn't know what to do. They went to Iran and asked for help because they were the only people out there that would provide the Houthis with any assistance. They got it. And so obviously they were at that point an arm of the Iranian octopus. And so eventually the war ended in a stalemate. The Houthis were actually the ones that prevailed. Even in the United States, the terrible famine that was brought on by all of this had killed tens of thousands of people. Finally, in Washington, people said, oh my God, this needs to stop. We told the Saudis no more, we won't support it. So it ended. Well, now the Houthis have decided that they are Arabs. So are the people that we call Hezbollah. They may be Shiites, but they're also Arabs. The so-called Shiite militias in Iraq that are all, quote unquote, Iranian-backed, which is the effort to try and convey the impression that Iran controls everything these people do. They're Arabs. The people in Hamas who are being killed in great numbers are Arabs. We're up to what, 23,000 dead now. And so the Houthis have said, we are demonstrating our solidarity to our Arab brothers who are being murdered in Gaza. And until the efforts against them stop, we're going to make it miserable for commercial traffic through the Red Sea. Now, bear in mind, these are now much more sophisticated people than the ones they were a few years ago. They actually know who registers the ship, who's an owner or a part owner. And all of the ships that they've attacked, I think with maybe one exception, have had either real complete ownership or partial ownership by Israelis. And so they said, if you're a part owner or you own, because remember, the thing is flag. It may be a Panamanian ship that flies some other flag, but it doesn't tell you who owns it, who's profiting from moving oil, liquefied natural gas, food, whatever. They've been able to find out. And it doesn't take much to stop commercial traffic. They don't have the newest and most lethal weaponry. They're using weaponry that's old, but is still potentially lethal. And they've had some success in damaging ships. They haven't sunk anything. But if you're an insurer sitting in London, like Lloyd's, you're not going to insure any ships that go through the Red Sea until this is gone. And we have been pushed and pushed and pushed to, well, you've got to go down there and do something. I mean, the Israelis want us to do something because the Israelis can't use their port of Aqaba. They can't get through the Gulf of Aqaba or down where the port of Eilat is. They can't move anything up through the Suez Canal and then around in the Eastern Mediterranean to Israeli ports. So the Israelis said, you've got to do something. So after much gnashing of teeth and so forth, we did. Now, keep in mind that the Houthis were prepared and they were actually informed before the strikes went in. So I'm not sure we did much damage. And friends of mine who are on the inside that looked at the target set told me that we were hitting targets that we hit back in 2015 and 2014. In other words, these aren't new things that we haven't struck in the past. So I don't think it had much effect, but I think it probably made Mr. Netanyahu very happy, and it made people on the Hill happy because, in theory, this could lead to war with Iran, which is the real goal. We've got to go to war with Iran. Iran is the enemy. So I don't think it's had much impact on the Houthis. I don't think the Houthis are about to surrender and go away. I hope we don't try to land soldiers or Marines to chase them through the mountains down there. The terrain is terrible. It's a rotten place to fight anybody. The British were down there in Aden years ago in the 60s, and they finally said, to hell with this, and went home. I hope we don't bother with that. I wish we would talk to them and see whether or not we could come to some sort of arrangement. We know what their demand is, which is to stop what's happening in Gaza. We understand that, but maybe there's some room for discussion. We have this bad habit of sanctioning and bombing everyone who doesn't agree with us. It hasn't worked, and it's not going to work with the Houthis. But the real danger, as we started this, and I apologize for the long diatribe, the real problem with this is it's really about Iran. And we don't understand that all of that oil infrastructure up and down the Persian Gulf and into Saudi Arabia, it's all very fragile. It wouldn't take much to damage any of it. And that has huge implications for us and for the world economically.
Yeah, well, it was Senator Lindsey Graham who said that we should bomb every one of Iran's oil fields over the Israel attack. I mean, that would have had global repercussions that we can't even imagine. And yet he was willing to do it at the snap of a finger. Thank goodness he doesn't control the nuclear buttons, you know? Oh, gosh.
Well, he's the combat lawyer, remember? His great claim to fame is he's a veteran.
Yeah, he's a
And
JAG lawyer.
Afghanistan, and he was in Iraq. And what did he do? Well, he was an attorney in the forward operating base. That's like saying I led the Boy Scout troop, along the border with Mexico.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great example. When you were telling that that setup of Iran and that unmanned aircraft to be shot down, I couldn't help but think of how the military and the CIA were trying to trick JFK with a fake airplane being shot up by Cuba in order to justify. I mean, it's almost like they were trying to set Donald Trump, trip him into a war. But he saw through it and asked questions just like JFK did. Um,
Well,
now,
the other thing is we got to give President Trump credit for something. And look, I have a lot of affection for him. I like him, but he has good instincts, and he listens to them. And his instincts said the American people don't want a war. A war is not good for anybody. A war will not help this country. A war will not help anyone who lives in the Middle East. So I'm not going to do it. Thank God. I don't see any evidence for any sort of instinct with this man Biden, or for that matter, most of the rest of the candidates. I think RFK Jr. would be inclined to say no too, but the rest of them, forget it.
yeah, yeah. Um, why did Biden unlabel or remove the Houthis as a terrorist group in 2021? Had something changed? Because now this morning I read he's definitely putting them back on the terrorist watch list. I guess I don't understand it.
Neither do I really. And I'm not familiar with the reasoning behind it. I'm sure there are people out there that can tell you whatever the rationale was. But the point is, it didn't last long, and they're back on the hit list. And that's the way that's where they're gonna stay. Pretty soon, everybody in the Middle East is going to be on that list.
Yeah. Okay, final question. I appreciate you coming on. You brought up Donald Trump. He has just barnstormed Iowa. He won by a number bigger than any Republican in the party's history. That doesn't mean anything other than he's got one state. We'll see if it's a pattern in New Hampshire. But how might Donald Trump react to with presidential power react to the crisis at the southern border? Because as of yesterday, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he wants a bill that allows 5,000 illegal immigrants into the country 365 days a year, immediate work visas, a place to live, food, cell phone, lawyers. Just bring them in and push them on the path of citizenship from hour one. How would this president behave differently than the current administration?
I cannot imagine Donald Trump ever signing on for any such thing. He knows what's happening. Schumer is out to destroy us, people like you and me. That we are the problem. We are the Americans who stand in the way of our denationalization. Uh, the left wants to convert us, and the left is not alone because they have fellow travelers on the right. I think if you look carefully at the announcement that came out last night, Senator Langford from Oklahoma, a supposed Republican, he's somebody we would call a rhino, decided, oh, sure, I'll sign on for this with Schumer, and this will solve everything. Just as amnesty that was finally approved by Reagan back in the 80s solved everything. Yeah, sure. As soon as he approved amnesty, that's when illegal immigration took off on a scale that had never been seen before in the history of the country. And we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. The point is that the more people you can bring into the United States who are fundamentally different from us, who do not share our values, our interests, they have no interest in the United States. They don't want to be Americans. A friend of mine who's from El Salvador sent me a note last night and said about this whole situation. And he said, it took me 6 years to become a citizen. And he said, I'm very proud of being a citizen. He said, then I ran into people from what was it, MI 14 or 15? I can't remember the gangs out of
Oh,
El Salvador.
yes, the MS-13.
MS-13, that's right. He said I ran into some people who were in MS-13 who had just run in, and I guess they joined the Marine Corps because that was a path to citizenship. They could stay here permanently, do their time, learn some useful skills, and then get out and continue their criminal activities. Uh, this is a catastrophe for us, and Schumer knows it. He wants it. Langford may or may not know it. I think he's just responding to donors. Who knows how much money is being spread around into various PACs on the promise that if you go ahead with us and help us to ruin America, turn it into some extension of the unwashed developing world so that our republic dies and everything that we associate with being an American is vanished, then you can have all this money. I mean, I think it's what it boils down to. I have less and less confidence that there are very many people holding high office in this country who really care about us anymore.
Yeah, seems to be an insider's game for how to win in the stock market while pretending to care about the American people. Oh man. Well, Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on, keeping us in the loop on the Russia-Ukraine situation, the continued war propaganda and fear mongering to scare America. I read just this morning that like people in Sweden are so afraid that Putin is going to attack that their mental health crisis phone lines are like hours long waiting. They've scared their people so much that they're literally, these rumors of war are giving them panic attacks. It's just sad.
Look, the Swedes and Finns, the population in those countries were very alarmed by the sudden arrival of U.S. troops and equipment and technology up near the Arctic Circle. Obviously, we wanted access to bases there, and we're rushing up there ostensibly for the purpose of threatening Russia. This is very dangerous because the Russians present no threat. But if we continue to try and encircle and threaten Russia, God knows what happens if we try to put missiles and radars up there. All sorts of terrible things could happen in the future, but they will be things that we provoked and precipitated. The Swedes and the Finns are, as a group, I would characterize them as sheeple. They believe whatever they're told by their governments. I've been to Sweden many times, and I always loved the place, enjoyed the people, but one of the problems I had with them is that they would always respond to a question, why do you do this, X, Y, and Z? And the Swedes would say, well, the government has made a study and determined that it is good for you. And I, as an American, I said,
Yeah.
Why the hell would you trust your government? I don't trust mine. And I don't believe in unconditionally supporting anybody anywhere for any reason. I want to know why. I thought that's a big part of being an American. That's what distinguished us. Everybody that came here said, we've had it with the old regime. We want to have a say in what happens. And if you start doing things to us, we're going to say, why? I don't hear very many whys.
Yeah. If President Reagan tried his famous joke there, it wouldn't land. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. They'd be, oh, come on in, come on in, sit on my furniture. So, well, hey, thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. Your military insight is invaluable, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Stephen.